I peered through the floatplane window as we descended toward the glassy surface of the lake. The water rippled beneath us, surrounded by dense pine forest that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. After 3 hours of flying over nothing but wilderness, Clearwater Lodge appeared. A collection of wooden buildings nestled on the shore of a small island. The plane touched down with a splash that sent water spraying past my window. We skimmed across the surface before slowing near a weathered wooden dock where a figure stood waiting. As we bumped gently against the dock's edge, I grabbed my duffel bag and climbed out, my legs unsteady after the long flight. "Richard Bryant?" The woman who greeted me looked to be around 60, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was tanned and lined from years in the sun, and she wore a flannel shirt despite the summer heat. "Yes, that's me," I said, extending my hand. "You must be Autumn Nichols." Her handshake was firm, her hands calloused. "Welcome to Clearwater Lodge. Hope the flight wasn't too rough." "It was fine," I said, though my queasy stomach disagreed. I'd never been in a floatplane before, and the constant vibration and noise had left me feeling off balance. "Good. Let's get you settled." She nodded to the pilot who was unloading the rest of my bags. "Thanks, Jim. See you next week with the new guests." I followed Autumn up a dirt path from the dock. The main lodge was an impressive 2-story log building with a wide porch and stone chimney. Several smaller cabins were scattered around it, all facing the water. "Lodge has been in my family for 3 generations, Autumn said as we walked. "Started as a fishing camp back in the 40s. Now we get all types: fishermen, hikers, city folks looking to disconnect." "It's beautiful," I said, taking in the view. The lake stretched out before us, surrounded by hills covered in pine trees. The air smelled of wood smoke and pine needles. "Your cabin is this way." She led me past the main lodge to a small cabin set slightly apart from the others. "Staff quarters. You'll have it to yourself until the busy season starts next month." The cabin was simple but clean. A small bedroom with a twin bed, dresser, and desk, plus a tiny bathroom with a shower. A window overlooked the lake, and a small wood stove sat in the corner. Bathroom works, but the water's finicky. Sometimes runs brown for a minute before it clears up. "Don't worry, it's safe to drink once it clears." Autumn stood in the doorway while I set my bags on the bed. "Kitchen's in the main lodge. Staff eats together at 5:30 before the guests. You'll help with breakfast and dinner service, plus the usual maintenance. Cleaning cabins, chopping wood, fixing whatever breaks." "Sounds good," I said, eager to prove myself. This summer job was perfect. Room and board, plus a decent salary, all while being surrounded by nature. After 4 years of college in the city, I needed the break before starting my real job in the fall. "One more thing," Autumn said, reaching into her pocket. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and handed it to me. "Rules. Read them. Follow them." I unfolded the paper, expecting the usual employee guidelines. Instead, I found a handwritten list. 1. Always be polite to strangers you encounter in the woods. Greet them and wish them well. 2. Never go out on the lake after dark. 3. Stay indoors during storms. 4. If you hear unusual sounds at night, do not investigate. 5. Never swim alone. I looked up at Autumn, waiting for her to crack a smile, to let me know this was some kind of joke they played on new employees. Her expression remained serious. "These are unusual rules," I said carefully. "They're important," she replied flatly. "This is remote wilderness. Things happen out here that city folks don't understand." I nodded, trying to look appropriately solemn while mentally filing this under quirky local superstitions. I'd encountered similar things before. Don't whistle in the woods, leave offerings at certain trees, never fish in the North Bay. Every rural area had its folklore. "I'll follow them," I promised. "Good. Get unpacked and meet me in the kitchen in an hour. I'll show you around the rest of the place." After Autumn left, I unpacked my clothes and arranged my few personal items on the desk. The cabin was rustic but comfortable enough. I read through the rules again, smiling at their oddly specific nature. Clearly, these were the accumulated wisdom of generations of locals, probably based on practical concerns dressed up as supernatural warnings. Don't go on the lake after dark was just good safety advice. Stay indoors during storms was common sense. I tucked the list into my pocket and headed to the main lodge for my orientation. The rest of the day passed in a blur of new information. Autumn showed me the kitchen where I'd help prepare meals, the tool shed where equipment was stored, the boathouse with its row of aluminum fishing boats, and the various guest cabins I'd be responsible for cleaning. She introduced me to the cook, an older man named Frank who barely looked up from his prep work, and to 2 local women who came in daily to help with housekeeping. By evening, my head was swimming with information about septic systems, boat motors, and the lodge's ancient electrical wiring. After a quiet dinner with Autumn and Frank, I retreated to my cabin, exhausted. I fell asleep almost immediately, only to wake several hours later to the sound of rain pounding on the roof. A flash of lightning illuminated my room, followed by a crack of thunder that seemed to shake the cabin. The storm had arrived suddenly and with surprising intensity. I checked my phone just after midnight. The rain continued to hammer down and wind howled around the eaves of the cabin. I pulled my blanket tighter, remembering rule number 3. Stay indoors during storms. No problem there. I had zero desire to go outside in this weather. Just as I was drifting back to sleep, I heard it, a sound distinct from the storm. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps, crunching on the gravel path that circled my cabin. I sat up, instantly alert. The footsteps continued, slow and measured, moving around the perimeter of my cabin. They didn't sound like someone running for shelter from the storm. They were too regular, too purposeful. My first instinct was to go to the window and look out. I even swung my legs over the side of the bed before remembering rule number 4. If you hear unusual sounds at night, do not investigate. The footsteps continued their circuit, passing by my window now. I caught myself holding my breath, straining to hear over the sound of the rain. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was large. The footsteps were heavy, making the gravel crunch loudly with each step. Another flash of lightning, another crash of thunder. The footsteps paused momentarily, then resumed, still circling. I slid back under my blanket, pulling it up to my chin like a child afraid of monsters under the bed. I felt ridiculous, but also genuinely unnerved. There was something unnatural about those footsteps, their steady, unhurried pace despite the raging storm, the way they maintained a perfect circle around my cabin. I lay there, listening as the footsteps completed another circuit, then another. Occasionally they would stop, as if whatever was out there was listening, before continuing their relentless circling. After what seemed like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes, the footsteps began to fade. Not as if the person was walking away, but as if they were somehow becoming less substantial, less present, until I couldn't hear them at all. I remained frozen under my blanket, heart pounding, until I eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning arrived with clear skies and birdsong, as if the night storm had never happened. I woke feeling groggy and disoriented, the memory of those circling footsteps still vivid in my mind. After showering and dressing, I stepped outside. The ground was still wet from the rain, but the day promised to be sunny and warm. I walked slowly around my cabin, scanning the ground for footprints. The gravel path showed no signs of disturbance beyond what the rain had caused. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to indicate anyone had been circling my cabin in the middle of the night. I widened my search, checking the edges of the path where the gravel met the grass, looking for any sign of passage. Nothing. I stood there, hands on my hips, trying to make sense of it. Had I dreamed the whole thing? No. I was certain I'd been awake. The footsteps had been too clear, too distinct from the sounds of the storm. But if someone had been walking around my cabin, they would have left some trace. Unless I shook my head, dismissing the thought before it fully formed. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was just the wind moving something around the cabin, a loose branch or piece of equipment. Or maybe one of the other staff members had been checking the cabins during the storm, though that didn't explain the lack of footprints or why they would circle my cabin repeatedly without ever knocking. I took one last look around, then headed toward the main lodge for breakfast. Autumn's list of rules tucked securely in my pocket. Whatever had happened last night, I was glad I'd followed rule number 4. Some part of me knew with absolute certainty that looking outside would have been a terrible mistake. I mentioned the footsteps to Autumn over breakfast. We sat at the wooden table in the empty dining room, morning light streaming through the windows. The other staff hadn't arrived yet. "So, I heard something strange last night during the storm," I said, buttering a piece of toast. "Footsteps, walking around my cabin." Autumn's hand paused midway to her coffee mug. She looked at me, her gray eyes sharp. "Did you look outside?" she asked. "No, I remembered rule number 4. Her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good." She picked up her mug and took a sip. "Following the rules is important, Richard. More important than most people realize." She didn't ask for details or seem surprised. Just nodded once and returned to her breakfast, the conversation clearly over. I waited for her to elaborate, but she remained silent, focused on her food. "That's it?" I finally asked. "You're not curious about what I heard?" "I know what you heard," she said simply, "and you did the right thing by staying inside." She stood up, taking her empty plate to the sink. "We've got guests arriving at noon. I need you to check the boats and make sure they're all fueled up and ready." I wanted to press her for more information, but her tone made it clear the subject was closed. Whatever had circled my cabin, she knew about it and didn't seem inclined to share details. After breakfast, I spent the morning helping Frank prepare for the guests' arrival. We stocked the kitchen, cleaned the common areas, and I made sure all the guest cabins were ready. By early afternoon, the new arrivals had settled in, and Autumn gave me permission to take a few hours to explore the property. I decided to check out the hiking trails that looped through the woods behind the lodge. The main trail was well marked, with blue blazes painted on trees, winding through dense pine forest. The air smelled of sap and damp earth, and patches of sunlight broke through the canopy overhead. About a mile in, the trail curved around a large boulder. As I rounded the bend, I stopped short. Between 2 tall pines about 30 yards ahead stood a figure. Tall and motionless, the figure wore dark clothing that seemed to absorb the surrounding light. I couldn't make out any facial features from this distance, just the unmistakable silhouette of a person watching me. My first instinct was to turn back, but then I remembered the first rule on Autumn's list: be polite to strangers in the woods. I raised my hand in a friendly gesture. "Hello there," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The figure didn't respond or move. It just stared at me. I could feel its gaze even if I couldn't see its eyes. We stood like that for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds. Then, without hurry, the figure took one step backward, then another. On the third step, it simply wasn't there anymore. It didn't run or duck behind a tree. It just ceased to be visible, as if it had stepped through an invisible doorway. I stayed rooted to the spot, heart thumping in my chest. Part of me wanted to turn around and head back to the lodge, but curiosity pushed me forward. I approached the place where the figure had stood. The forest floor was covered with a thick carpet of pine needles between the trees. I searched carefully, looking for any sign of disturbance. Broken twigs, compressed needles, anything that would indicate someone had been standing there moments ago. Nothing. The pine needles lay undisturbed, as if no one had walked there in weeks. I expanded my search, moving in widening circles, checking behind trees and rocks. Not a single footprint or broken branch. It was as if the figure had been a mirage. "Hello?" I called again, feeling slightly foolish. "Is anyone there?" My voice echoed briefly before the forest absorbed it. Birds chirped overhead, unconcerned. A light breeze rustled the pine needles. Nothing else moved or made a sound. I stood there for several more minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. The figure had been real. I was certain of that. But its disappearance and the lack of any physical trace left me questioning my perception. Eventually, I continued my hike, though with less enthusiasm than before. I kept glancing over my shoulder and scanning the trees ahead. The figure didn't reappear, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When I returned to the lodge, I considered telling Autumn about my encounter, but decided against it. She'd been dismissive about the footsteps. I doubted she'd be more forthcoming about this. Besides, I'd followed her rule. I'd been polite. Whatever that figure was, it hadn't harmed me. The next morning, I headed down to the boathouse to prepare the boats for the day's fishing excursions. As I approached the dock, I stopped short. 2 of the aluminum fishing boats were drifting about 20 feet from shore, bumping gently against each other in the light morning breeze. I frowned. I'd secured those boats myself the previous evening, double-checking each knot. I was certain they'd been properly tied. Sighing, I kicked off my shoes, rolled up my pants, and waded into the cold water to retrieve them. As I pulled the first boat back to the dock, I examined the rope. It wasn't frayed or broken. It looked as if it had been untied and deliberately set adrift. When I mentioned this to Frank as we prepared breakfast, he just shrugged. "Happens sometimes," he said vaguely, flipping pancakes on the griddle. "Wind can do funny things." But there hadn't been much wind overnight, and knots don't untie themselves. I let it go, but the next morning, the same thing happened again. 3 boats this time, drifting farther out on the lake. Again, the ropes showed no sign of breaking. They'd been untied. That evening, a middle-aged couple who'd been staying in cabin 3 approached me as I stacked firewood outside the main lodge. "Do you know if there are other people staying across the lake?" the woman asked, wrapping her cardigan tighter around herself despite the mild evening. "Not that I know of," I said. "The nearest camp is about 5 miles north. Why do you ask?" "We heard voices last night," her husband said. "Coming from across the water. Didn't sound like English." "What did it sound like?" I asked, suddenly interested. They exchanged glances. "Hard to describe," the man said. "Almost like singing, but not quite. Words we couldn't understand." "Did you see anything?" I asked. "Any lights?" "No," the woman said. "It was too dark, but the sounds carried clearly over the water." I thanked them and promised to mention it to Autumn, which I did. She listened without comment, then simply reminded them, and me, about rule number 2. Never go on the lake after dark. The strange occurrences continued. On my 4th night, I was in the main lodge tuning the old radio that sat on a shelf behind the front desk. Autumn used it to get weather reports and occasionally communicate with the nearest ranger station. As I turned the dial searching for the weather frequency, the static suddenly cleared, and a voice came through. It wasn't the usual ranger or weather announcer. The voice spoke in what sounded like whispers, rapid and urgent, in a language I couldn't identify. I leaned closer, trying to make sense of it. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, almost as if the speaker knew I was listening. Then abruptly, the voice stopped. A high-pitched tone replaced it, growing in intensity until I had to cover my ears. Just as suddenly, it cut off, and the radio returned to normal static. I turned to find Autumn standing in the doorway, watching me. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Turn it off," she said quietly. I switched off the radio. "What was that? Who was speaking?" "Just interference," she said, but her expression told me she didn't believe that any more than I did. "The radio acts up sometimes. Best not to use it unless necessary." By my 5th day at Clearwater Lodge, I found myself constantly on edge. I jumped at unexpected sounds. I scanned the tree line whenever I was outside. I double-checked the locks on doors and windows before going to bed. Yet I kept working, trying to make sense of everything I'd experienced. The footsteps in the storm, the figure in the woods, the untied boats, the voices across the water, the strange radio transmission. I followed Autumn's rules religiously now. I stayed inside during the brief thunderstorm that rolled through on my fourth night. I was unfailingly polite to everyone I met, human or otherwise. I never ventured onto the lake after sunset. But questions kept piling up, with no answers in sight. What exactly was happening at Clearwater Lodge? What were these rules really protecting us from? And why did Autumn seem to accept it all as normal? I was determined to find out, but also increasingly uneasy about what answers I might discover. I sat at the stainless steel counter in the lodge kitchen, scrubbing at a particularly stubborn bit of dried sauce on a large pot. The kitchen was quiet except for the occasional clank of dishes and the soft squeak of my sponge against metal. Frank had left about an hour ago after dinner service, leaving me to finish the cleanup. Most of the guests had retreated to their cabins for the night, and Autumn was busy with paperwork in her office. The kitchen window was cracked open slightly, letting in the cool night air. The lake stretched out beyond the window, a vast darkness punctuated only by the reflection of stars on its surface. I'd been avoiding looking at it after sunset, following rule number 2 religiously. I dunked the pot into the rinse sink and was reaching for a towel when I heard it. A scream that cut through the night air like a knife. I froze, the pot dripping water onto my shoes. It wasn't an animal. No, this was unmistakably human. High-pitched and filled with terror, it echoed across the water, seeming to come from the far shore of the lake. I rushed to the window, my heart hammering in my chest. Scanning the darkness, I spotted it, a small light flickering on the opposite shore. Barely visible, but definitely there. It wavered like a candle or a small lantern. Someone might be hurt. The scream had sounded desperate, filled with genuine fear. Rule 2 flashed in my mind. Never go on the lake after dark. I bit my lip, torn between the safety of the rule and the possibility that someone needed help. What if a hiker was injured? What if someone was lost in the woods? The light continued to flicker, seeming to call to me across the water. Before I fully realized what I was doing, I was out the kitchen door, moving quickly down the path toward the boathouse. The night air felt unusually still, with no wind rustling the trees, just the sound of my footsteps on the gravel path and my own breathing. The boathouse was dark, but I knew where the light switch was by now. I flicked it on, illuminating the row of aluminum boats tied to the inside dock. I grabbed a flashlight from the hook by the door and untied the nearest boat. As I pushed off from the dock, a voice in my head screamed that I was breaking the rules. Rules that had seemed more important with each passing day. Yet I couldn't ignore that scream. What if it was a guest who had wandered too far? What if someone was dying out there? I started the outboard motor, wincing at how loud it sounded in the quiet night. The boat cut through the dark water, leaving a small wake behind me. I pointed the bow toward the flickering light on the far shore, keeping my flashlight trained ahead to avoid any floating debris. I'd gone maybe a quarter of the way across when the air around me changed. A fog began to roll in, not gradually, as fog normally does, but quickly, like someone had turned on a smoke machine. It curled around the boat in thick tendrils, unnaturally dense. The temperature dropped so suddenly that I gasped. My breath came out in visible puffs, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me. This wasn't normal fog, not in how it moved or how it felt. The cold bit into my skin with an almost deliberate malice. I looked back toward the lodge, hoping to orient myself by its lights, but there was nothing. The fog had swallowed everything, leaving me floating in a gray void. The only sound was the puttering of the boat motor and the soft lapping of water against the hull. I slowed the boat, trying to get my bearings. The light I'd been heading toward was no longer visible either. Had I veered off course? I tried to use the stars for navigation, but the fog obscured the sky completely. That's when I felt it. A change in the water beneath me. The boat began to rock, gently at first, then with increasing violence. The surface of the lake started to churn, bubbling and swirling around the boat as if something massive was moving just below. A low rumbling sound rose from the depths, not mechanical but organic somehow, deep and resonant, like the groan of some enormous creature. The boat pitched wildly, nearly throwing me overboard. I grabbed the sides, white-knuckled, as water sloshed over the gunnels. Rule 2. Rule 2. The words flashed in my mind like a warning beacon. With trembling hands, I reached for the motor and switched it off. The sudden silence was deafening. Then, guided by some instinct I couldn't name, I turned off my flashlight too, plunging myself into complete darkness. I sat perfectly still, barely daring to breathe. The churning of the water continued for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two. Then, gradually, it began to subside. The violent rocking eased into gentle swaying, and the rumbling sound faded until I could no longer hear it. The fog, too, started to thin. Not completely, but enough that I could make out the dark silhouette of the shoreline in the distance. I waited several more minutes, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might provoke whatever was beneath me. When I finally felt brave enough to try restarting the motor, I turned the key and pressed the starter button. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. I tried again with the same result. A third attempt produced nothing but a sad, clicking sound. "Come on," I whispered, my voice sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. "Please." But it was no use. Whatever had happened, whether the thing in the water had damaged it somehow or it had simply failed at the worst possible moment, the motor was dead. I looked around, trying to gauge how far I was from the lodge. Through gaps in the fog, I could now make out the faint glow of lights from the main building. It seemed impossibly far away. There was nothing for it. I found the paddle stored under the seat and began the long journey back to shore. The first few strokes seemed normal, cutting through the water with expected resistance. But as I continued, I noticed something strange. The water itself seemed to be fighting me. With each stroke, I felt a current pulling against the boat, trying to drag me away from the island and out toward the center of the lake. It wasn't a natural current. It moved against the wind, against the normal flow of the water. It felt intentional, as if the lake itself was trying to prevent my return. I dug the paddle deeper, putting my whole body into each stroke. Sweat broke out on my forehead despite the cold. My arms burned with the effort, but I kept going, focusing only on the next stroke, then the next. Time lost meaning as I fought against the water. My world narrowed to the rhythm of paddling. The dip of the blade, the pull through resistant water, the lift and repeat. I didn't dare stop, afraid that any pause would lose the little ground I'd gained. The lights of the lodge grew incrementally closer, though much more slowly than they should have. Whatever force was working against me wasn't giving up easily. My hands developed blisters that broke and bled. But I kept paddling, driven by a primal need to get back to shore, to get away from whatever dwelled in the depths of the lake. The current seemed strongest when I was directly facing the lodge, so I tried tacking at an angle, making my way in a zigzag pattern that seemed to meet with less resistance. It was working. I was making better progress now, though my arms felt like they might fall off at any moment. As I finally approached the shore, the unnatural current gave one last surge, as if making a final attempt to claim me. I threw all my remaining strength into fighting it, and suddenly, like a rubber band snapping, the resistance vanished. The boat lurched forward, nearly capsizing before gliding smoothly into the shallows near the boathouse dock. I sat there for a moment, panting, my muscles trembling with exhaustion. The lake behind me was calm now, showing no sign of the churning waters or the thing that had moved beneath them. The fog had mostly dissipated, revealing a clear night sky above. If not for my soaked clothes, aching body, and the damaged motor, I might have convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't. Whatever was out there on the lake, whatever Autumn's rules were meant to protect us from, it was real, and I had just had a very close encounter with it. I blinked awake to find myself sprawled on the wooden planks of the dock. My clothes were still damp, clinging to my skin. Every muscle in my body ached. The sky had lightened to a pale gray blue, with streaks of pink and orange stretching across the horizon. Birds chirped in the trees beyond the shore. I tried to push myself up, but my hands burned with pain from the raw blisters. I didn't remember falling asleep or passing out on the dock after dragging myself from the boat. The last thing I recalled was sitting there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had happened out on the lake. "Richard!" I turned my head to see Autumn hurrying down the path toward the dock. Her face was tight with concern, her gray hair escaping from its usual bun. "What happened to you?" she asked, crouching beside me. I opened my mouth to answer, but my throat felt like sandpaper. I just shook my head. "Come on," she said, helping me to my feet. "Let's get you inside." She let me lean on her as we made our way up the path toward the main lodge. My legs felt like they were made of rubber, and every step sent pain shooting through my muscles. We passed the cabins where guests were still sleeping, unaware of what lurked in the lake they'd come to fish in. The main lodge was quiet and empty this early in the morning. Autumn guided me to a chair in the kitchen and filled a glass with water, which I drank greedily. "Stay put," she said. "I'll make coffee." I watched as she moved around the kitchen, measuring grounds into the filter, filling the reservoir with water. The familiar routine seemed bizarrely normal after what I'd experienced. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling the kitchen with its comforting aroma. Autumn pulled out a first aid kit from beneath the sink and took my hands in hers. I winced as she cleaned the broken blisters with antiseptic. "What were you doing out on the lake?" she asked quietly as she wrapped gauze around my palms. I took a deep breath. I heard a scream from across the lake, and I saw a light. Her hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "I thought someone needed help," I added. "Rule 2, she said simply. "Never go on the lake after dark." "I know, I'm sorry, I couldn't ignore it if someone was in trouble." She finished bandaging my hands and poured 2 mugs of coffee, sliding one toward me. I wrapped my bandaged hands around the warm ceramic, grateful for its heat. "Tell me everything," she said, sitting across from me. So I did. I told her about the scream and the light, about taking the boat out, about the fog that came from nowhere and the way the water started to churn. I described the rumbling sound from below, how the boat nearly capsized, and how I'd turned off the motor and light on instinct. I told her about the current that fought against me as I tried to paddle back, about how it felt like something was actively trying to pull me toward the center of the lake. As I spoke, Autumn's face grew more and more grave. The lines around her mouth deepened, and her eyes took on a haunted look. She didn't interrupt, just nodded occasionally, her hands gripping her coffee mug so tightly her knuckles turned white. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time, staring into her coffee as if it might hold answers. "I'm sorry about the boat motor," I said, trying to break the silence. "I can pay for repairs." She shook her head. "That's not important." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the lake, which appeared perfectly calm and innocent in the morning light. "The lodge is closing next week," she said finally. "What? Why?" I asked, surprised by this sudden announcement. She turned back to face me. "Because things are getting worse." I waited for her to continue, taking a sip of my coffee. "This island," she said slowly, "was a sacred place before the lodge was built. My grandfather didn't know that when he bought the land. Or if he did, he didn't care." She sighed. "There are presences here, ancient ones. They claim the land and the water." I felt a chill run down my spine despite the warm coffee in my hands. The rules exist for a reason, Richard. They maintain a balance between us, humans, and forces we can't understand. Forces we shouldn't try to understand. She looked directly at me. "By breaking the rules, you've disturbed that balance." "I didn't mean to. I know you didn't." She cut me off. "Your intentions were good, but that doesn't matter to them." I thought about the footsteps circling my cabin that first night, the figure in the woods that vanished into thin air, the boats that kept coming untied, the voices across the lake, and the whispers on the radio. And now whatever was in the lake, trying to drag me down. "You need to leave," Autumn said. "Today, I'll call Jim to bring the float plane." "Today?" I echoed. "But what about my job? What about the guests?" "Most of the guests left yesterday. The rest are checking out this morning." She paused. They felt it too, even if they couldn't name it. The unease, the watching eyes. I nodded slowly, remembering the couple who'd reported hearing strange singing across the lake. "Whatever you encountered out there last night," Autumn continued, "it knows about you now. It's aware of you, and that's dangerous." I thought about the way the current had fought against me, how personal it had felt, like a direct confrontation rather than just a natural phenomenon. "I'll pack my things," I said. Autumn nodded. "I'll call Jim. He can be here by early afternoon." Back in my cabin, I threw my belongings into my duffel bag with shaking hands. My clothes from the night before were still damp, so I left them hanging in the bathroom. I didn't want to take anything from this place with me anyway. As I packed, I kept glancing out the window at the lake. It looked so peaceful, sunlight dancing on its surface. Hard to believe that just hours ago it had nearly claimed me. I thought about the rules Autumn had given me that first day. Be polite to strangers in the woods. Never go on the lake after dark. Stay indoors during storms. Don't investigate unusual night sounds. Never swim alone. They had seemed quaint, almost superstitious. Now I understood they were survival instructions. When I finished packing, I took one last look around the cabin. It had only been my home for a week, but it felt like much longer. I'd come here looking for a quiet summer job, a break from city life. Instead, I'd found something I couldn't explain, something that defied rational understanding. I walked to the main lodge, noticing how quiet the property was. The cabins that had been occupied just yesterday now stood empty, their doors closed, curtains drawn. No guests chatted on porches or carried fishing gear down to the boats. Even Frank was nowhere to be seen. Autumn was on the phone when I entered, confirming details with Jim about the float plane. She hung up and turned to me. "He'll be here at 2, she said. I nodded, setting my bag by the door. "What about you?" I asked. "If things are getting worse, shouldn't you leave too?" She smiled sadly. "This is my home, Richard, my family's legacy. I can't abandon it, not yet. I need to close things properly, secure everything for winter." She paused. Maybe by spring things will settle down again. But her eyes told a different story. She didn't believe they would. We spent the remaining hours in uneasy silence. Autumn made sandwiches for lunch, but I could barely eat. My mind kept returning to the lake, to what might be lurking beneath its surface. At 1:45, we heard the distant drone of an engine. We walked down to the dock together, and I watched as Jim's yellow float plane descended toward the lake, sending ripples across the water as it landed. Jim taxied to the dock, his usual cheerful expression replaced with something more solemn. He must have picked up on the mood, or maybe Autumn had told him something when she called. "All set?" he asked as I approached. I nodded, handing him my bag to stow in the plane. I turned to Autumn. "Thank you," I said, not sure what else to say. How do you say goodbye to someone after experiencing what we had? She squeezed my shoulder. "Take care of yourself, Richard. And be careful, even when you get back to the city." I wanted to ask what she meant by that, but Jim was already gesturing for me to climb aboard. I gave Autumn one last nod, then stepped into the float plane. As we taxied away from the dock, I looked back at Clearwater Lodge. Autumn stood on the dock, a solitary figure against the backdrop of pine trees and log cabins. She raised her hand in farewell, then turned and walked back up the path toward the main lodge. The plane picked up speed, skimming across the lake's surface until we lifted into the air. I watched through the window as the lodge grew smaller and smaller, the lake stretching out below us like a mirror reflecting the sky. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders as we flew away from that place. Whatever I'd encountered there, whatever ancient presence claimed that land and water, I was leaving it behind, heading back to civilization, to normality, to a world that made sense. As the island shrank to a tiny speck and then disappeared altogether beneath us, I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. I was going home. The strange encounters, the unexplained phenomena, the rules, all of it was behind me now, or so I believed. I'd been back in Toronto for 2 weeks, trying my best to forget everything that happened at Clearwater Lodge. My apartment felt both comforting and strange after my time in the wilderness. The constant background hum of the city, car horns and distant sirens replacing the eerie silence of the forest. I kept telling myself I was safe now, away from whatever ancient forces lurked in those woods and that lake. My routine helped. I woke up, made coffee, went to work at the bookstore downtown, came home, watched TV, and slept. Normal life, safe life, city life. No rules to follow except the ordinary ones that governed civilized society. I just settled onto my couch with a microwave dinner when my phone chimed with an email notification. I almost ignored it. Probably just another promotional offer from some online store I'd shopped at once. But something made me check it. The sender's name made my stomach drop. Autumn Nichols. The subject line read simply, Rule 5. I nearly dropped my phone. Rule 5 from her list, never swim alone. It had seemed the most normal of all her rules, the one that could be explained away as basic water safety. But now, seeing it isolated as the subject of an email sent weeks after I'd left the lodge. I tapped the email open, my dinner forgotten. The body of the message was completely blank, just empty white space beneath that ominous subject line. "What the hell?" I muttered to myself, scrolling down to check for anything I might have missed. Nothing. Just Rule 5 and emptiness. I hit reply immediately and typed, "Autumn, what's going on? What are you trying to tell me about Rule 5? Are you okay?" I sent the message, then waited, refreshing my inbox every few minutes. After 20 minutes with no response, I tried again with a shorter message. "Please explain. I need to understand." This time, the email bounced back almost instantly with an automated response. Message undeliverable. The address you are trying to reach does not exist or is no longer active. I tried a third time with the same result. The email address that had just contacted me apparently couldn't receive replies. I put my phone down and paced around my small apartment trying to make sense of it. Rule 5. Never swim alone. What was she trying to tell me? Was she in trouble? Or was she warning me about something? I glanced out my fourth-floor window at the darkening city. The streetlights were coming on, casting pools of yellow light on the sidewalk below. Everything looked normal. Ordinary people going about their evening routines, heading home from work or out to dinner. I tried calling the lodge's landline, but got only a disconnected tone. Autumn had mentioned closing up for winter. Maybe they'd shut down all communications until spring. I eventually gave up and tried to sleep, but my mind kept circling back to that blank email and its cryptic subject line. I dozed fitfully, waking at the slightest sound. Around 2 in the morning, I jerked fully awake. Something had changed in the ambient noise of my apartment building. I lay still, listening. There it was. A sound I'd hoped never to hear again. Heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching on the gravel decorative border that ran along the sidewalk surrounding my building. The same measured pace I'd heard circling my cabin during that storm at Clearwater Lodge. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Rhythmic, purposeful, unhurried. I sat up in bed, my heart hammering. This was impossible. I was hundreds of miles from the lodge, back in the city, surrounded by other people in their apartments. Whatever had stalked me at the lodge couldn't have followed me here. Crunch, crunch, pause, crunch. The footsteps continued their circuit. I could track the sound as it moved around the perimeter of the building. Just like at the lodge, it would pause occasionally, as if listening or considering. I got out of bed and moved to my window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer down at the sidewalk below. The street was empty at first glance, just parked cars and pools of light from the street lamps. Then I saw it. Standing directly across the street, perfectly centered beneath a streetlight, was a tall figure in dark clothing. It stood motionless, head tilted back, staring directly up at my window. At me. I let the curtain fall back into place and stumbled away from the window, my back hitting the wall. It had seen me. It knew exactly which apartment was mine in this building of over 50 units. The footsteps had stopped the moment I spotted the figure. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor, knees pulled up to my chest. What was I supposed to do now? Call the police? And tell them what? That a mysterious figure from a remote wilderness lodge had somehow tracked me to Toronto and was standing outside my building? I stayed there on the floor for what felt like hours, listening. The footsteps didn't resume. The figure had stopped circling once I'd seen it. Now it was just waiting. Around 4 in the morning, I gathered my courage and crawled back to the window, lifting the edge of the curtain just enough to peek out. The figure was still there, still motionless, still staring up at my window. I watched it for nearly an hour as the sky began to lighten with pre-dawn glow. As the first true light of dawn broke over the city, the figure changed. It didn't walk away or turn or move at all. It simply became less there, fading like morning mist until the spot beneath the streetlight stood empty. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching Clearwater Lodge online. There wasn't much, just a basic website that hadn't been updated in years, showing the same cabins and lake I remembered, with Autumn's contact information and rates for the fishing season. Nothing about ancient presences or rules to follow. Nothing about the history of the place before it became a lodge. I tried calling the number listed, but got the same disconnected tone as before. As night fell again, I found myself checking the street below every few minutes. The figure didn't return that night, or the next, but I knew it would be back. The email about Rule 5 made more sense now. Never swim alone wasn't just about water safety. It was a warning that I was now permanently connected to whatever I'd encountered at the lodge. That connection had formed the moment I took that boat out onto the lake at night. I'd broken the rule, and in doing so, I'd drawn the attention of something ancient and patient. I couldn't break the connection by simply leaving the lodge behind. Distance meant nothing to it. I'd glimpsed something beyond human comprehension, and now it would watch me from the shadows for the rest of my life. I thought about moving, changing my name, trying to hide, but somehow I knew it would find me wherever I went. The thing that had circled my cabin, that had nearly dragged me to the center of that lake, that had now tracked me hundreds of miles to my home. It wasn't bound by normal limitations. I would have to live with this knowledge and this presence indefinitely. The rules had been there to maintain a balance, and I'd disrupted that balance. Now I was forever transformed by what had happened at the lodge. As I sat in my darkened apartment that night, I realized that in some ways, I'd never truly left Clearwater Lodge at all. Part of me was still there, or rather part of what lived there was now with me, and always would be.